Professor Ken Mayhew from the University of Oxford, thank you for joining us for the second International Forum on Global Management and Education. It's been a pleasure to have you here.
It's been a pleasure to be here.
I would like to ask you a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Okay.
You are the Director of SCOPE, Skills, Knowledge and Organizational Performance. Could you put that for us in perspective, what that all means? Skills and performance.
Okay. A lot of emphasis in Britain has been on improving human capital. That is, more and more money into the education system, more and more money into higher education, more and more people going to university, and more qualified workforce. What we're interested in is partly what happens there and how it's achieved, but more importantly from our point of view, what happens to people when they've had their education, they've had their training, how does it link into how they do in the labour market, the people they work for in the labour market and the national economy.
So this really means, what are we teaching these days? Is it relevant for the labour market? How do we teach it? What do we teach? How much time does it take? Is it economically justifiable? And what does the diploma really mean?
It depends on what sort of diploma. If we think just of post-compulsory schooling, that is, children in Britain after 16, then some quite deliberately go into direct vocational training. They want to become nurses, so they take a nursing degree. They want to become an electrical engineer, so they take an apprenticeship at Rolls-Royce. Other educational decisions that young people take are less clearly directed to the labour market. The two examples I've given to you, they're getting their training and they know what their occupation, their profession and even their employer is going to be. Most young people go into some form of post-compulsory education, a bigger and bigger percentage of those into things that are laughingly called universities, though some are not worth the name. And most of those go into universities with no real idea of certainly who their employer is going to be, and very often what their occupation is going to be. And in one sense that's a very good thing. If you go to a good university and you study something which appears to be totally irrelevant for the labour market, as I did, which is history, my view is if you go to a good university and you do well in history and employers are sensible in their hiring policies, what they're looking for is not how much you know about when Christopher Columbus sailed to the New World. They're looking at how it's developed your general intellectual and cognitive capabilities, and it will help you in the labour market. The great danger is a lot of students go to not very good universities and try to pick vocational courses, which really will not link into the labour market, though they think that they might, and which at the same time do very little to develop their general thinking skills and therefore help them to learn more when they finally do get jobs.
One of the countries that has always practiced the vocational training is Germany. It has been a long tradition in Germany. You could become a shoemaker, an electrician, or whatnot. It has been very coordinated by the federal authorities, but it wasn't academia, it wasn't the university level, and the economy has developed very well. How do you relate in today's world academic training to the success of the gross domestic product of a country?
Okay, incidentally, it's not just Germany. What's interesting, it's the German-speaking countries who've always had a very strong vocational apprenticeship, really even stronger in Austria, and probably even stronger in Switzerland as well, at least the German-speaking bit of Switzerland. I think what's happened in many other countries, and probably more in my country than others, is, for reasons which are not entirely clear, the stress has been on university education. The higher the level, the better in the minds of policymakers. And that has helped to actually, if not destroy, massively weaken traditional routes. So that for a whole variety of reasons, including actually the policies towards apprenticeships from past governments, but for a whole variety of reasons, including the expansion of higher education, the reputation of the apprenticeship route has declined, and the availability of apprenticeships has declined. So children who once would have taken that route are almost now forced to go to university for want of anything else to do. And very often what you find them doing at university is doing what would have been done in a more traditional German-style route at one time. A good example is there's an ex-polytechnic, now university in North London, which has a 3-year bachelor's degree in hairdressing and management. Now, I'm sure they produce good hairdressers who know how to do their books, but in the old days, a boy or girl would have left school at 16, got a job as an apprentice with a local hair salon, and be given day release to learn commercial skills at the technical college. And that was probably more cost effective than the new route. So we've been trapped into something rather silly. Another interesting example is nursing, which I mentioned earlier. Until about 20 years ago, perhaps 25 years ago, if someone wanted to be a nurse, it was then almost certainly a girl. There are now more male nurses. The girl would get a job in a National Health Service hospital as a trainee nurse, and she would learn on the job, heavily supervised, with time off for study and exams. That route is now totally closed. If you want to be a nurse, you've got to go and do a 3-year degree at university. And there was an interesting period.
Is that economically justifiable?
It's more costly.
It's more costly.
So the question is, does the university make better nurses? There were 2 very interesting studies about this, 2 independent studies. There was a period of about 15 years where both routes were available, the traditional route and the university route. So these 2 studies did the same thing. They took 2 groups of nurses, one for the traditional route, one for the university route, and compared their performance 10 years after. And they found that in every respect except one, the performance of the old-fashioned route nurses and the university route nurses found the performance exactly identical. The one respect in which it was different was the traditional route nurses were better at handling patients.
So that really leads to
Yes.
So when I talk to young students, I just wonder at times why they choose the career they have chosen and why they have chosen a certain school that they have chosen. And it appears that some of them just want to have the justification of the diploma with a good reputation name, and others are more interested in acquiring a certain skill set in order to actually contribute to whatever's going on in the labour market. What's your stand with that?
Well, people are very different, so it's dangerous to generalise. But if you took the typical student today, perhaps with the typical student 30 years ago, I think there are some differences. First of all, in terms of the college you go to, I think students are very aware of hierarchy. That we have a group of universities which are called Russell Group universities, about 29 of them, and they're top of the hierarchy. And there's a hierarchy within the Russell Group. Then there's another band of universities below that. So they're very aware where any given university stands in that pecking order. And their first priority is to get into the best university they can. It's all done in the form of national competition. Why do they do that? Well, perhaps for some of them it's because they think they'll get a better education at that university, but it's mainly because they know that it's likely to get them a better position in the labour market when they've graduated. So choice of university, I think, is very much linked to labour market prospects. Choice of course, I think people are very different there. I think some people go and study things at university because they're interested in it. But I think more and more, and you can't blame them, are thinking further ahead into the labour market when they choose their subject. Now, in one sense, it was always the case. We've always had university law courses. People went and still go to university because they want to be lawyers. Similarly, engineering. But I think you can see other subjects which are not so directly vocational, where you see the changes. I'm an economist, and there's an interesting example of it there. Britain was a long way behind America, some would say a long way ahead of America, in that we didn't have business schools for a long time. They were a very new thing in Britain. And economics departments flourished because students thought, economics, that must be relevant for the real world, and employers will want to hire us, blah, blah. Then business schools emerged, and students stopped learning economics. because they thought that business was much
the
more
preference changed according to the expectations.
And that is very much labour market.
Professor Mayhew, it was a pleasure to have you in Brazil. Thank you so much for joining us and have a safe trip back home.
Thank you for inviting me.